Well, we're going to start with introductions, and then we'll get that situated in a second. So thank you for coming out. My name is Derrick Cain. I'm the Director of Community Engagement. And in a moment, we'll have a slide up there, please.
Where are you based?
Resolve, Philly, in the United States.
And specifically Philadelphia.
Yeah, you can catch your mic. All right, we're getting closer. And this is my first time in Germany, too, so thank you for welcoming me, for ones that were from here, and also to the Bond Festival for having us, because this is definitely my first time over here, and I'm enjoying it so far. I'm still getting a little used to this time, because we're 6 hours behind on you guys, so last night I didn't get any sleep, because I'm up like as if it's the United States time, so thank you. Yeah.
I was going to say almost the pre-introduction kind of period. I used to live in Germany, so ich habe in Berlin gewohnt für nur ein Jahr, and so it's lovely being back, but I love that the context is, you know, Derrick and another colleague from Resolve were among the first two speakers confirmed for this festival, so I love that I can be here to help with the presentation.
Right. All right, so we're going to get started. Like I said, the slides will catch up to us, actually.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about Resolve Philly. Resolve Philly is a journalism nonprofit, and our initiatives push the field of journalism to be more equitable, collaborative, and based in community voices and solutions. And Aparna, if you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say Aparna Mukherjee,
Yes.
the Chief Programs Officer of Resolve Philly, Derrick Cain, our Director of Community Engagement. In the name, Resolve Philly, obviously we're based in Philadelphia in the US, and having said that, the name of our organization has placemaking and the communities that we focus on. Resolve Philly is also national and international in terms of the scope of the work we do and how we bring community engagement to the fore.
So I want to give a quick little context to how I am getting into this space. I don't say that I'm a journalist, even though if my co-executive director was here, she'd say, "You're a journalist." But I always say I'm journalism adjacent, because I don't come from the traditional J school or background in journalism. So with that, I'll start with how I got to Resolve Philly. In 2009, I was incarcerated with a 10-year mandatory sentence for the first-time offense in the United States. So about 2 years later, in 2011, while I was incarcerated, the Philadelphia Daily News reached out to me and wanted to do a piece talking about my case and how mandatory minimums led a surge in inmates, and how criminal justice, especially mandatory minimums, should be looked at, because it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. So to my point, about 2 years later, they did the piece on me, and the piece was a good piece. It was talking about my, not having any prior convictions, anything like that, but to get such a harsh sentence on my first-time offense, they thought that that law should be looked at. So about 2 weeks later, a gentleman wrote in the comment section about my article, saying that basically he just said, "I'm not a good father, I'm not a good son, I'm just a drug dealer." It was just like really harsh. And when I read that comment, even though I knew the stereotypes that are attached to formerly incarcerated, when it's you that they're talking about, it really hit home a little differently. So for me, at that moment, I started thinking how it was mandatory for me to change my narrative, and from that point on, I started working on me as a person, but also changing my narrative for when I got released. Fast forward to 2017, I was released. I did 8 years, 3 months, and I started doing community service work, mentorship, speaking with youth, doing all types of speaking engagements, talking about my story, hopefully using that as motivation for others. A woman named Celeste Trusty saw that there was a Philadelphia Criminal Justice Journalism Fellowship, and she thought that I would be good for it. And when she presented it to me, I was saying, "I'm not a journalist, and I barely been out of high school, so how am I going to do this?" She said, "Don't worry about it, just apply for it." So I did, and I ended up getting it. Out of 6 people that I was one of the 6 out of many people who were applicants for this fellowship. During that fellowship, Gene Friedman-Radulski, who was the co-executive of Resolve Philly, was doing a solutions journalism workshop. And for me, that hit home. I didn't want to just talk about the problem, I wanted to talk about solutions. So a colleague of mine at the time saying, "Hey, Resolve Philly is hiring. Would you want to join the team? They're hiring for a community engagement editor." Again, here we go with this. I'm not a journalist. I don't know nothing about editing or anything like that. But I know communities. I could do that standing on my head. So I decided to go ahead and throw my name in the hat. Lo and behold, in 2019, June of 2019, I was hired as the community engagement editor at the time.
I think from the perspective of thinking about how Derrick has joined an establishment that we call journalism in the United States, that this trajectory of taking what one person's experiences have been and thinking strategically about what that means when we talk about audiences, sources, all of these different roles that we've known to expect and to kind of like set out there in the world is what at Resolve, and I feel like Derrick's specific story of how he came to Resolve is such a good illustration of how we're changing what the starting point of journalism and the context of this is. Thinking about what the experience of the person who has been interviewed or is the subject of a story, and using that as the jumping point of your career into journalism is such a great kind of way of thinking about how we approach journalism full stop at Resolve.
Right. So when we're talking about now, we're here at the Bond Future Festival, right? Oh, we're good?
I think
we're getting
so.
closer. We're getting closer.
This
So,
is just
we have
the
something on the screen,
pre-hype kind
so we're
of
getting
intro
closer,
game.
right? So we're going to talk a little bit about Resolve. Resolve. So we're at the Bond Future Festival, right? So we're thinking about, and I know we are strategically thinking about what does that newsroom of the future look like, and how we look at that is through our three pillars: participatory, responsive, community journalism. We look at our second pillar of bridging the information divide, and our third pillar of collaborative journalism. Now, within those three pillars, we think strategically on how do we, one, have community involved throughout the full process of the journalism process. It's from start to finish. It's not an afterthought. It should be something that's thought about in the beginning when you're getting ready to write your pieces or your organization is talking about the next topic are you going to cover in that community. It's understanding that the community should be a part of it throughout the full process. That's a part of the participatory journalism piece, the participatory responsive journalism piece of it. And then we talk about the bridging the divide, the information divide. I know in City of Philadelphia, most community members feel like they don't have enough information. They want news that they can use. I think that's where we have a disconnect oftentimes. And oftentimes, too, because of this gap of mistrust that we have in media, especially nowadays, folks don't really trust journalists, to be honest with you. And now they feel like when you're coming into the community, you're just gonna parachute in, get your sound bites, get your quotes, and leave out, and they're never gonna see you again. Or you're only gonna come when it's a murder or some violence that's happening in your community. Again, folks don't really feel that doesn't always accurately reflect their community, even though it might be some things happening there. It's always some great things that are happening that's never being captured within that journalism piece or that journalism organization's reporting. And then you have the last one, which is our collaborative journalism, which Aparna can speak a little about too, and hopefully we can get started with the slides.
I'll take the baton from Derrick. The collaborative journalism piece I'm especially thrilled to speak about because while in our intro we talked a little bit about ourselves, I should kind of out myself that at a festival about the future of journalism, a lot of my experience is firmly entrenched in legacy media organizations. So I am in the older kind of category of people who work in our newsroom and at Resolve Philly. I'm in the 50-something-year-old category as of this week. And I bring that up because I got my start in journalism in Philadelphia as a teenager at the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is the newsroom that encompasses the paper that wrote about Derrick's case in the first place. Right. So that was in the late 80s. So in the time since the late 80s until 2023, when I effectively started working at Resolve, I've worked at some of the largest news organizations in the world. And I bring all of this up because in our news collaborative in Philadelphia, soon to be launched with the new name, the Philadelphia Journalism Collaborative, or PJC, we have some of the biggest news organizations in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia as our partners, the Philadelphia Inquirer, WHYY, which is our big public broadcast outlet, and then we have some of the smallest and emerging micro newsrooms. So we have, for example, Love Now Media, which in its name has the word love and community and has everything from metaverse projects to fashion shows and a magazine. We have the Philadelphia Gay News. We have Word Radio, which is Philadelphia's only owned and operated Black music and news station. Or news station. So when I think of all the different players we have in our news collaborative, They are focused in different subject matter categories in some cases, different communities, different languages, including Spanish and Vietnamese. We have that kind of diversity represented in a group of newsroom partners who are really coming together to highlight specific themes: economic mobility, gun violence, reentry of incarcerated residents coming back into community. These are different socially viable, socially relevant, and inequity gap focused categories of news. And whether you're a big news organization that's for profit or a small one that's focused on a certain community, we all come together to decide how to fund certain news projects.
So what my job is now, I'm currently the director of community engagement now, no longer the editor. What we're tasked to do with the community engagement team is to Aparna's point, when we talked about the news organizations, we have 29 news organizations within our collaborative. And what Resolve Philly is the nonprofit that houses that journalism collaborative. And what we do as a CE team is we work with all of those news organizations to get out in the community to build relationships. So we like to call ourselves navigators. We're gonna get into the crux of the stuff, guys. What we call ourselves is navigators. We're navigating complex relationships between communities and journalists, right? It's that gap that I talked about earlier. And how do you get the community to understand and the journalists to understand that if you work together, you can have more authentic reporting that reflects the communities that you're reporting on. So how we do that? We do that with, and this is the part of the pillar where we talked about participatory and responsive community journalism. We have what's called sound-offs. Sound-offs are small group conversations, normally between 5 to 25 people. And the reason why we keep it small, because historically we found that when people are in smaller groups, they're more engaging. People are more likely to speak because of smaller groups versus the bigger kind of me talking at you type of situation. Then we also have the sound off info session. Now the info session is bringing information back to the communities that they feel they need more of or want more of. So we talked about earlier, news that you can use. Oftentimes these sound off info sessions, they're designed to help bring back information that the news that they could use. So they love that. We have the town hall as kind of a placeholder, but we haven't used it yet in the 4 years. We just have it there just in case we may have a bigger event where it may warrant a town hall, but we stick to the sound off conversations and the sound off info session. That's important for our participatory, and we also have our info hub captains, and Aparna can speak more to that, and we also have our kids, which is also a form of info hub captains where it's specifically geared towards the foster care system. So if you can talk about that.
Yeah, so the Info Hub Captains program is one in which instead of going to different communities and saying, hey, what do you want to see? What would you like city or county or state government to know about your communities? Because I will say, like to Derrick's point, town halls, these different names of different types of convenings that we have sometimes overlap with what government does, like in terms of trying to get feedback from communities. And what I've noticed both as a reporter, as someone who's spent time in the public sector, and certainly in these last several months at Resolve, is that extractive piece of if you as a journalist or an organization that's trying to elicit community opinion and responses, keep going back, the same people keep telling you what they need or want, and nothing changes. I think that's very different than with our Info Hub captains, where we're saying the work that you are already doing as a community leader is something that we want you to bring to the table and share with us and with other community leaders. And based on that, we can come up with stronger ways of both sharing the work you do with our newsroom partners and other audiences. We can also help amplify and find resources for your work, but most importantly, which I hope if you take away one thing from this, and I think is really coming through in what Derrick is sharing, with or without slides, is that the first point and the last point has to be community needs and community voice. And that is what the Info Hub captains in the most ideal way do. We take, besides the fact that we meet on a monthly basis, and so we connect them with each other, we use what they're bringing to the table for a print newsletter that we put out in the community. And I will say with the print newsletter specifically, during COVID, which is when we launched this, we had a drop of 20,000 of these newsletters. That was in a time when, like, how do you get information that's relevant to your life? So we had many more than we do now, about 5,000 for each of these releases. So, you know, something like the future of journalism might be a print newsletter, might not seem totally intuitive right away, but that is because, as you'll see with some of the examples in these beautiful slides, that what the information needs, the way you deliver the information is not as important, like the form factor, as we say in product development. That is not the focus. Yeah, that'd be great. But how do we actually represent what the voice is in community and how we put that out there, that's really the core of what we're doing.
All right, we're back. Okay, so we pretty much talked about all this, so we're gonna kind of speed through this, but again, as we introduced ourselves earlier, all right, let's see if the clicker works.
Sorry, we changed the computer, so it's not your computer. And
Okay.
Okay, well, you can click to the next one. Yes.
We can-
Because we pretty much talked about this. You can click through here. We talked about Resolve.
Yep.
Okay, so I want to hit this again because this is important, those three pillars. We talked about the participatory community responsive journalism, the bridging the information divide, and the collaborative journalism. We touched on the collaborative journalism, which is the 29 news organizations. We talked about the bridging the information divide by the newsletter and our InfoHub captains and community-centered journalism, as well as the participatory, which also falls under the InfoHub captains, where it's participatory and community responsive journalism. You can click again. That was like the hyper versions. Quick. All right, so we're gonna play, we're gonna get into each of the different pillars and then show a quick video and then have a quick discussion about it. Yes, you can play. Basically, it's gonna say the same thing I just said. So just bear with me here, bear with me. Oftentimes, journalists doesn't really, one, reflect the communities that they're reporting on, and two, really don't know the community in general. So I think a lot of times, and that's where this gap has grown over so many years, and why folks feel a little hesitant talking to journalists because they feel like their story won't be represented accurately.
I think in my career, which is as Broken Philly does things, I think it's about trying to make the news more approachable and just more accessible in general.
By doing the tabling and getting to know people and being out and volunteering, we actually volunteer oftentimes as well, and just getting to know folks, it kind of peels back layers of mistrust because now they understand, okay, you may be a journalist, but they know who you are now. They see you in the community. You're not just there then parachuting in and getting your soundbite and leaving. You're actually want to know what's going on in the community. You're curious about the community and also will want to tell a story that's reflective of the community accurately. So I think all of those things plays a part in our tabling and our sound offs and everything that we do. It's about building relationships. That's why our #1 priority as a community engagement team is relationship building. And then trust oftentimes are peeled back because they understand now. They have a better understanding of the process of journalism. They have a better understanding of the person that's coming into their communities, and they feel more comfortable talking. So this is the quote. You want to read the quote?
It felt really important to me that there be a greater representation of outlets that were led by people of color and serving communities of color. And I think you saw in that little video that many of us look like the communities we're serving, but at the end of the day, it's whatever Philadelphians need, that's where we're going to show up, and we have either history in those spaces or we're connecting with the leaders who do.
Just a quick question before we go to the next slide. How many are traditional journalists, like legacy, works at legacy news organizations? Just to show of hands, how many folks are in here?
I would say
As-
organizations that existed for more than, say, 15 years.
Yeah.
That's totally arbitrary.
How many have no journalism background? Oh, okay.
That's like almost half the audience.
Yeah, right. That usually doesn't happen that way. That's good.
The future of journalism.
Right. You can click to the next one. So again, we talked about briefly about the difference in how this is a part of our pillar of the newsroom of the future, but the bridging the information divide. In the city of Philadelphia, oftentimes, folks feel like they don't have enough information, as I shared earlier. So we kind of honed in on that. We honed in on that by going out in the communities, seeing what it is that they're missing. And how we do that is when we're having these conversations, we start off with, what do you love about your neighborhood? We don't go out there with just going to see what it is and talk about problems all the time. We start about, what do you love about it? And most folks were taken aback by that because they're not used to it. One, a journalist coming out there and asking them, what do they love about their neighborhood? So that question in itself brings out so many different things that happen in their communities, things that they love, but it also the problems arise as well, because they start to say, you know, my neighborhood is changing because of gentrification. I don't even know my neighbors anymore. So much is happening in my community that I wish it would go back to the way it was, or I wish we could work with the new folks that are moving in our communities as well, so we can kind of coexist together. So these are just some of the conversations that we talk about. And also, we're talking about bridging the information divide. One thing that was talked about in a neighborhood called Strawberry Mansion in North Philadelphia was, and this is right before the pandemic, that traditionally in Black and brown communities, we don't talk about estate planning. And that's just something that bubbled up over the conversations at the sound off conversation. And for me, it was like, wow, that's true, right? Because we don't in our community talk about estate planning and stuff like that. So what I did was we went back to the newsroom. We had a conversation about that. We pitched it to some of our news collaboratives. And what we wanted to do was bring estate planning lawyer back to the community and have that conversation. That was called an info session. News that they could use. We brought the journalist back, or the lawyer back as well, with journalists there, to talk about how to do estate planning. And this is now, we're in the pandemic and we were actually doing it virtually. So we had to do it virtually at that time because we were all shut down. And we had a lot of people show up to really learn more about power of attorneys and how to do estate planning. And after that, folks really felt like, wow, I've never been a part of something, especially journalism-wise, where it was something that you came to our community initially, and then you actually came back and had something for us. And they were just really intrigued by that. And that's how we continue to strategize and build relationships within these communities. Next slide.
I was about to say,
Sorry.
Unfortunately, my German is not good enough to remember some of these words, but that is when someone dies and there's a will, and so like how do you divide up the assets,
Right.
the whatever it is?
Like a testament?
Wie
Like
heißt das? Testament. Yeah.
Right. Can you go to the next slide?
Right. My goal was basically, I had to come up with a strategy for engagement for the whole news collaborative at the time, 26 news organizations. And for me, it was about building relationships first. So I had to build relationships with the community in order for me to, one, come up with a plan, but two, to take those relationships and also build relationships with the journalists and work as kind of like a navigator, because we navigate complex relationships between communities and journalists and build those relationships and try to bring them together in order to do authentic reporting in our communities.
It can make a fundamental change in the kind of journalism you do if the first step is to go engage with folks. Because instead of starting at an editorial meeting where a bunch of journalists sitting around a table or on Zoom saying, well, this is the story I think we should do, we had ideas that came from those listening sessions of either things people wanted to know, or why do you not pay attention to this, all those kinds of things that made the reporting just so different, and I think just more useful. Making sure we're meeting the information needs of the people who are most living with the consequences of the kind of violence.
And that was Jean San, our director of collaborations, who, by the way, jumped from one of the biggest news organizations, WHYY in Philadelphia, to lead up our collab. I could read this on behalf of Jingyao Yu, who works with Derrick and was a part of the planning of this original session. Sometimes solution pieces help people navigate power and influence decision makers, but that's not always what the communities themselves prioritize. How does this directly, more immediately than now you just got to wait around and wait for policy makers to read our reporting? This is about being action-oriented now in terms of the ideas and putting those into play for journalists versus the official kind of version of now there's change.
So there's the collaborative journalism. So we talked about that earlier. It's the 29 newsrooms. Can you get the next one?
A lot of journalism in general is based in competition, where it's like you have to compete for readership. You don't want to link out to other newsrooms to lose readerships to other people. And Resolve kind of came in, Broken Philly came in and was like, put that to the side and let's discuss things that maybe will benefit our readership or, pool our resources together just to do better work.
The collab model tells us that we don't need to be competitive. And so how do you come up with something like that? That means if the solutions are outside of journalism, you need to bring in people who have worked outside of journalism. So the team that you and Cassie built, along with having some of those award-winning traditional journalism skill sets, that is a part of a healthy organization that is trying to think outside of the box and operate outside of the box.
I should say that video, by the way, included people who work at Resolve, people who benefited from the collab, and the last person up there, Diana Liu, is one of our funders. So, you know, we're involving a lot of different parts of what make up Resolve, our collab, and our news products. We're constantly involving everyone, which is a little different than a traditional newsroom.
I'm also curious, it's question-wise for the group, how many journalists in here are part of a collaborative or see that happening in their news organization? By show of hands. One?
Out of curiosity,
Oh, yeah,
where are
yeah,
you
yeah, there we
based?
go.
Like,
Yeah,
do you
I
want to
know
tell
about
us about
that.
your collab or the collab you're a part of?
Well, I'm based in Berlin and I work for DW, but within DW we collaborate across departments, and there's also a lot of other companies we collaborate with on a, I would almost want to say daily basis. So it happens more in large newsrooms, I would say, where you have the chance, but on the other hand, I used to work in Berkeley, in California for a hyperlocal magazine, and there what you're saying really happened. Like,
Was it Berkeley side?
yeah, at UC Berkeley, I studied and I worked there for a hyperlocal website, and so you could build trust within the community because you were reporting locally, whereas now, and that would be my question, it's almost impossible to actually report locally because most of the stuff we do is digital these days, especially since COVID. So how do you then build this trust over time when usually you don't have any time as a journalist to report on something, you go in and you say, you get your soundbite mostly through Teams or through Zoom, not even in person, and you leave again. Like, I stay in touch with my interview partners in hindsight, and I send them what I do, and I stay in touch, and I catch up, and I sometimes even get stories or story ideas that way, but like, we don't usually have time planned in for that in a large news organization like DW. So like, how do you then build trust and bridge this divide that you're talking about? Because I don't see that happening in my work routine, to be fair.
Good question. We
One
get
of
that
the
all-
experts
Yeah, we get
on
that all the
this.
time. I feel like this is where when I started at Resolve, one of my first things that I kind of said to the executive director is that this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? This is not something that's going to happen overnight. This mistrust has been happening for years, right? We're talking about this gap that's been getting wider for years. So you got to take the time. Now, for specific to a journalist versus a journalism organization, a journalist, we have a consulting firm, which actually we can pull up on that. You can hit the next slide that we work with news organizations as well as journalists to come up with tips and tactics of ways of doing things. And here's some of that. I'm gonna get you a question in a second of how we do that with community engagement or operational resilience, language reframing, collaboration, and we do that by consulting, coaching, workshops, and training. And how we do that is when we have trainings with a journalist, we talk about little things that journalists can do to build trust within just their reporting alone, because oftentimes we know in these larger news organizations, they're not going to give you the time to do that, at least not now. So how you do that is little things like, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I've talked to so many journalists over the past 4 years, and oftentimes, folks don't even say exactly what they're there to do. They don't even say, hey, you know, my name is Derrick Cain, I work for the such and such and such and such, I wanna do this piece, and kind of give a quick overview of what it is that you wanna do, and also how will you get back in touch with them, and just kind of give them an overlay of what does that workflow look like for them? Because they don't know who or what your job is or how your job works and all that. All they see is what's been happening for so many years and not much conversation, not much back and forth after that. So I think those little things like that helps to build trust, because now that person that had that first interaction with that journalist was like, wow, that person was nice. Now I understand the process a little more than I did before that person came to me and wanted to reach out about my story. So talking about little things like that. And then oftentimes, I also hear that when the piece is written, they don't even call the person back and say thank you. Little things.
Or doing a read back of quotes. I
Right.
mean, that, you know.
But even
in-
before
yeah.
that, it's
Yes.
like, that's so, you know, we get that part. But I really feel like, and I always try to hammer this in when I'm talking with journalists, it's not rocket science sometimes. It really isn't. It's the little things that makes that person feel like a human. Like that person's story, they're the expert. It's not that you're talking down to them. It's hey, we're doing this together. And I feel like when you have that type of interaction with a person, it just, again, it starts to make them, that fear, that mistrust, it starts to erode, because it's like, wow, this journalist was different. You hear that all the time when it's approached differently. So that's just to quickly answer your question as far as with individuals, but as far as organizations, that's probably about a 2-hour conversation.
I would say one of the highlights is someone who's just still feeling like I'm getting to know Resolve and what the processes and approaches are, and certainly as Modifier is taking this very hyper-local story we effectively have of how we're doing it in Philadelphia. In an earlier conversation today, I was saying one of the joys of working at a place like Resolve versus Bloomberg, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, actually NTV and Deutschland Radio Berlin when I was here, is that the smaller kind of conversation that you're having still has big picture implications. And the idea that as a journalist who's trying to get to know the world and the community you serve, I get that we use Teams, we use Zoom, we might even just use the phone as a phone and speak to someone, but until you're actually present in a community, and I think that physical presence really makes a big difference. So as a large organization or a news organization that doesn't have a history of convenings, of gatherings, of excuses to be within the community, I find that's a bridge that's really difficult to cross unless you have a strategy, you have tools, and you have a commitment that's consistent and committed to an over time relationship. As Derrick's pointing out, if it's the marathon and not the sprint, then I think setting up those almost like milestone, those guideposts of if you're right here, right now, which is you have pretty much zero community engagement strategy that's, I would say, in real life. Like the in real life versus not, you can support it between those convenings or like, you know, we mentioned InfoHub captains meetings. We do most of those over Zoom for right now, but they're grounded in the fact that we still show up in community. So I would say setting up your initial strategy of what it is that you want as an outcome and thinking, you know, certainly Modifier can help, and we have a lot of frameworks and tools that are sitting on the website, so it isn't necessarily like an engagement where we have to come in. There are some best practices, but I think there has to be kind of like that strategic vision for your news organization on what do you want to see, not as an audience development strategy, which is how most of us are used to thinking about newsrooms and communities, but what is your community engagement and investment? What do you want to put on the table in terms of resources, and where do you want to get to that?
I'm gonna be honest, when I'm talking with organizations, when I'm talking at the hierarchies up in these news organizations, I switch up how I speak about it because they don't really, I don't say they really care, but I think some don't really care, but some don't really focus on the community engagement piece. So I speak to them in a way where it kind of gets to if you really, at the end of the day, they care about the bottom line. And that bottom line is, of course, getting folks to either sign up, like, share, follow, all that stuff. And when you have journalists that take the time to do those little things, that will help the bottom line in the long run because now you're a trusted entity. And I think if these organizations think of it where it's like, okay, yes, this might not be a return on investment tomorrow, but it'll be a return on investment over time if I continue to allow my journalists to do or have this time to build relationships, because that will become, now we will start to become a trusted organization with that community member, which may turn into a subscription, may turn into a follow, may turn into a share, all those things that they look at as far as metrics. So that's important. But of course, at the end of the day, for some, they're not thinking about tomorrow, they're more thinking about how do we survive today. And I get that. But if you really want, I mean, when I say you really want, meaning the organizations really want community engagement to be built into their process and their organization, they have to get better at that. I know at Resolve Philly, I got you, in Resolve Philly, our second line item on our budget is community engagement. Only second to salary. That's how committed we are to community engagement. So if you really want to know about an organization that you're going to go to and you want to work with, and that's really where you're rooted in, want to be a part of, just ask, I mean, obviously they're going to try to give you a budget, but ask, where's that at? Ask, how committed are you to community engagement? What are you willing to do for me if I could join this team to allow me to go out and build relationships? I think that would be a question that you would ask. So.
What role does independent investigative journalism play in your community activities and building trust?
I was going to speak to two individuals in our organization who also are two of the folks who we highlight the most because of their award-winning work. Steve Olk is our investigations fellow, soon to have a different title that reflects how much we want to put into investigative reporting. And then Dia Robertson is our community narratives editor. And between the two of them, they work on a project that Derrick mentioned, Our Kids, and that's looking at the child welfare system and specifically the experience of foster kids in Philadelphia and outcomes that are related to that. So these investigative pieces that Steve is mostly writing with the help of Julie Christie, who is our Director of Special Projects and Data, which I mentioned specifically because that data reporting piece is such a big part of the scaffolding that allows Steve to do reporting that leads to actual legislative change. In the case, specifically, I'm thinking of a piece he wrote, that he and Julie wrote, that was about the amount of money that foster kids should be getting in the case of Social Security benefits that their parents, when upon dying, that they inherited, that had been sitting in a pool of funding, and while it wasn't technically malfeasance, the caregivers and the foster kids themselves, the foster youth, had no idea that they had tens of thousands of dollars sitting there waiting for them to turn 18 to claim. So that's a terrific example of specifically the data reporting, the idea that the story came up because within this Our Kids Vision Hub, we have effectively survivors of the foster care system getting together in a very sound-off-like setting where it's a closed room and they get to connect with one another, they get to express what the challenges are, and when that is the source of your reporting, there's an authenticity and a relevance, I think, that is very difficult to recreate just by virtue of saying, I'm an investigative reporter who's using official sources.
So you're building stories with the community.
With the community, exactly.
How do you make
Yeah.
it work?
Yeah.
Well, and
Because
you
this
know,
is what the challenge for absolutely everybody.
yeah, well, I love that we're having this conversation in Deutschland because I think of like how much, and we were having this conversation with a new friend and colleague from this conference, how much of the funding in Germany is public, like in terms of the main broadcasters, that there's not as much of that nonprofit journalism kind of component here because there hasn't been quite as much of a necessity. We, as a nonprofit solutions journalism and news collaborative, have very much a specific designation as a 501c3, so we are a nonprofit entity. So a lot of our grant funding and a lot of our projects, including with the Solutions Journalism Network, since I see another speaker and someone from there, a lot of this is the newness of nonprofit world and how we are funded through traditional foundations and grant makers. We are a part of a bunch of newer consortium pieces, and we have Modifier as the practice arm, which is a very new thing. We launched it last year, and this is taking these tools, frameworks, trainings that Derrick and team do, and we bring them to other news organizations. Some of them are through, for example, the American Press Institute. We work with SJN's labor cohort. So really, like, for right now, it's, I would say, like 95% still grant funded, and we're moving towards more diversity. Like any other news organization, we are trying to find multiple both funding streams and a pathway to kind of sustainability. But at the end of the day, we are not relying on either membership or subscriptions or advertising revenue for sustainability. Those, I think it's fair to say, as one of the executive team at the organization, we are not looking towards our audiences to be the source of our economic sustainability.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I think my biggest question for you all based on that last question is, when I say nonprofit news or a nonprofit newsroom, does that mean, is that something that, if you were familiar with nonprofit newsrooms or solutions journalism prior to today, do you want to raise your hand? Like, is that something most people know about? Because, you know, from my perspective, the idea that solutions have to be funded through nonprofit or public sector is just how we've been doing it. I think it's fair to say that the public sector piece of our funding is very small. For us, it's almost non-existent. But for example, in New Jersey, in Colorado, in California, in New Mexico, in the United States, there's all of a sudden a public funding mechanism. And it occurs to me, since so much of the audience in general for this festival and convening is based in Germany, that figuring out what it looks like to think of nonprofit in relation to the public sector feels like part of the conversation.
Is this working? Yeah. We recently had a situation where we did an interview with someone from a specific community here in Bonn, and it came up one day before the final text had to be finished that some of the things in the interview might be associated with like conspiracy theory stuff, and something that, or the way it was formulated, something that the main person responsible didn't want to publish under her name. And so I was wondering in that situation, because we felt like if we are publishing this interview in a changed version, we are not building trust at all with the person we're interviewing. And if that's a situation you've come across before, and yeah, what we can, I don't know, I'm not sure what my question is, but I felt like it was relevant.
All right, so I'm trying to get what you're saying. So you said this person they were trying to publish something that was a conspiracy theory?
It might, so the person we interviewed, she said some things that might be associated with conspiracy theory ideas, or, and yeah, we felt like we wanted to just say somewhere like, this is not our opinion, but we want to show what's going on, what motivates these people, and so on. Like, we just wanted to present that, and yeah.
So that sounds like an op-ed?
It sounds like it was a straight news piece, but that the opinions expressed by the person who was being interviewed had a conspiracy-oriented kind of thing.
Might be, yeah. But still, like, we wanted to, we want to build a trusting relationship with this community, and
Gotcha.
and I'm not sure how to bring something into the news that other people find super problematic, but yet deserves a voice.
I think in that situation, you'd be upfront with the person that you're interviewing and saying that, you know, what is your mission, what's your principles at your establishment, your organization. If it's going to be something where it's going to be problematic, and all, I think you'd be upfront about that and share that with the person. I feel like this. In situations like that, yes, we want to build trust, but at the same time, we also, this is the part of the journalism process that you want to make sure it keeps intact, that, you know, stuff's based on fact, right? You know, we get that there's something that you may believe in, but if it's something that, to your words that you use, is problematic, maybe it might not be the best thing to do, and also be upfront about that and share that with that person that, you know, this is something that we don't do here, or however you know, whatever language that you have for that. I think that probably would be the best way, because yeah, you want to build a relationship, but you also don't want to put up something that is going to be problematic at the same time. Also, being upfront about that, I think, still builds trust, because it's like you didn't BS them. You were upfront about what it is you can and can't do. And I think being true to that, what you can and can't do, is a part of the building trust, and especially communities, like, especially in Black and brown communities as well. I think that's the key to that. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Please. Another question?
I have a question about radio. Does radio play any role at all in the community? I say that because I've worked with teams in West Africa where, especially in fragile states, people are happy to talk to the microphone, but very afraid of the camera.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we have two collaborative partners, Word Radio and WHYY, who are radio only. So, not all radio, but
Yeah.
WRD
I mean, I think the
is
multimedia part
multimedia,
includes
right,
broadcast
right,
radio.
Right.
I think that's a really strong point of why, when we think about the distrust either with media or the unpredictability of outcomes, that part of the anonymity that you get with radio in relative terms could be because suddenly your face is associated with a news piece that maybe you don't necessarily, as the source and the interview subject, know what's going to happen. And I think that, like, you know, that's a big part, as I'm the person who's still diving into solutions mindset and this very community-centered kind of piece, is extrapolating from like what happens to you as the person who's being interviewed, all the different both emotions and outcomes you might not expect. So like the idea that there's more trust for a radio reporter versus a TV reporter makes a lot of sense to me. That clip for video could be used in so many different ways. So I think it comes back to Derrick's point of closing the loop of what happens to the piece later is such a core tenet of all this.
That worked perfectly in post-genocide Rwanda and in Burundi. Because the amazing thing, the organizations that were working there managed to bring Hutus and Tutsis together to work on the same piece, which was absolutely amazing, bearing in mind that in many cases they were talking about horrific things, and one of the reporters was probably part of the team that had committed that, or the group that had committed that. Right. Amazing stuff.
I think given we have 1 minute left on the piece, if there's another question, but if there isn't, I was going to say that last question and the idea that anything that we're talking about when it comes to building trust and understanding what happens is because we're there. Right. We're continuing in that relationship, and one wouldn't have necessarily thought that what is happening between warring factions could be relevant to how we cover news in the United States. But the fact is that, was there one more question?
Yes, one more question.
Okay, please.
Okay. Well, I just want to say this real quick too. Thank you for just being patient. I just want to say that. I always want to make sure I say that, but go ahead.
No, it was just a comment because I think even when you're not there locally and you can't connect to people in person, it is possible to do that across long distances too. And in the 10 years that I've worked for the company that I work for, some of the biggest successes I've had personally was because I kept in touch with my interview partners. I had built trust. I interviewed a woman from Saudi Arabia who started a hashtag to end male guardianship, and she really took a massive risk talking to an international broadcaster, and we made sure to blur her face, we made sure to change her voice. I stayed in touch with her over months and months, asking if she's okay, if something happened, and when she actually managed to flee the country, I was the first journalist that she contacted, and she was like, Sophie, I made it out, like I'm in New York, like I'm ready to show my face, like should we do a follow-up? And that story went viral, and it got so many clicks and so much attention, and that also helps when you talk to your bosses or to, you know, the managers who are interested in clicks and in KPIs, and like when you tell them like staying in touch with people and building this trust will actually translate in more stories idea, in more clicks and communities and trust and people signing up. I think that is the overall takeaway message that I've had over my years of working as a journalist, that it really does pay out to take more time doing the interviews too, not just being like, okay, I have these 5 questions, I have 7 minutes, right. Tell me all your trauma. Like, take time, like, get to know them, start in a positive way, and even if that means you have to transcribe 2 hours of an interview, in the end, the quotes you will have will be better, and they will do justice to the person you're interviewing.
Exactly. On that note, we're going to end it here. I'd like to, again, thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here with Aparna and I, and we love to be here. Also, we're going to be around, so if you have any questions, can you click to, also you can just click, take the picture of this and here, where you get our documentary and more about our collaborative. And yeah, feel free to move out. Thank you again, everybody. Appreciate you.